In today's video, we're going to analyze the whip-over technique. The whip-over is sometimes thought of as a lower level move that relies on raw strength with relatively little technique. But as we'll see, the whip-over can work at the highest levels, provided that certain technical details are met. The basic mechanics of the whip-over involve creating sufficient upper body rotation or torque. An important concept to understand is that upper body torque ultimately creates lower body torque. In other words, if I can generate sufficient upper body torque on an opponent, this can also cause the opponent's hips to rotate and result in the opponent falling to their hip or butt. As we'll see, the whip-over can be performed against a relatively static kneeling opponent, in transition against an opponent who just shot or who is defending a shot, and against an opponent on both feet. The simplest application of the whip-over is against a bent-over kneeling opponent, so let's start there. First, for this and other variations of the whip-over, we'll want specific upper body controls. An underhook on one side, we'll call this the near side, and a tricep grip on the other side, the far side. Second, if possible, we'll want to create a base advantage by getting to our feet while the opponent remains on one or both knees. This height advantage will give us more leverage to generate upper body torque. We'll see a few examples of the whip-over against a standing opponent that don't rely on a base advantage, but generally speaking, it makes the technique much easier to execute. Third, we will use our upper body controls, the underhook and far tricep, to change the angle and generate upper body torque. A crucial component of the whip-over is the pivot of the feet. This pivot does several things. 1, it changes the angle from head-on to near perpendicular. 2, it generates tremendous power from the hips. And 3, it allows for upper body torque to be efficiently created. As the pivot occurs, the underhooking arm raises the opponent's near shoulder upwards in a similar motion to a boxer throwing a hook, while the tricep grip pulls the opponent's far shoulder downwards, like performing a single arm dumbbell row. An analogy that may be useful for visualizing upper body torque is the hands of a clock. Prior to the generation of torque, the opponent's arms are at roughly 9 and 3. After the torque is generated, they are at somewhere closer to 12 and 6. All of these elements together cause lower body torque in the direction of the opponent's far hip, which the opponent may or may not be able to absorb. Generally speaking, an opponent on their knees will have a much more difficult time absorbing the same degree of lower body torque as they would on their feet. Now that we've gone over some of the basic elements of the whip-over, let's see another example against a static kneeling opponent. First, establish upper body controls. Second, obtain a base advantage. Third, use the upper body controls to change the angle, generate power from the hips, and create upper body torque. In this clip, the offensive wrestler also drives into the opponent after changing the angle. Although the offensive wrestler gets a takedown, let's take a look at how the defensive wrestler was able to absorb the lower body torque with a foot post. As the upper body torque is generated, the defensive wrestler is able to momentarily shift his weight to his left hand. He then transfers his weight to a wide foot post, which provides the stability to absorb the lower body rotation. Let's take one more look at our first two examples. Next, let's see a few examples of the whip-over executed in transition. Probably the most common variation of the whip-over used at the higher levels is as a counter to an offensive wrestler's shot. Here, the defensive wrestler catches an underhook, remains on both feet, and powerfully pivots to his left as he punches the underhook and pulls on the tricep control. It's important to point out that opponents will sometimes, voluntarily or not, reach their underhooked arm forward as the technique is performed. This movement concedes the takedown, but also unwinds the upper body torque and keeps the opponent off their back. Here, the defensive wrestler sprawls, sees an opening for a left underhook, and explosively drives in at a perpendicular angle as he punches the underhook and pulls inward on the tricep grip. Similar situation here, with the defensive wrestler seeing an opening for an underhook and explosively pivoting to generate upper body torque. Notice how the opponent quickly concedes the takedown and posts his right hand to the mat. This post allows the opponent to pull his left tricep back to his side and mitigate the upper body torque. Lastly, we have an example of the offensive wrestler attempting a shot, then quickly capitalizing on the defending wrestler's subpar positioning to execute the whip over. Let's see each of those clips one more time through. In this video, we've seen the whip over performed against a static kneeling opponent and against an opponent on one or both knees in transition. We will save the more rare and complex standing variation used by Hassan Yazdani for the next video. We'll close out with a few clips of the standing variation as a preview for what's to come.